war, the president said. This time there was a new name for it. This time in 1950, it was called something else. But the troop ships were leaving in the same old way, and the women watched them go in the same old way. It looked like war. It hurt like war. It was war. It was that war in Korea. It was a hard war to explain. What are we doing in this hellhole 7,000 miles from home? What are we doing here? Somebody called it a war we couldn't win and couldn't quit. A limited war. But they kill you just as dead in a limited war as in any other. There's no limit on death. Here in Korea, 54,000 Americans went all the way. As far as any American ever went at Valley Forge, or Gettysburg, or in the Argonne, or at Iwo Jima. Here dead we lie because we did not choose to live and share the land from which we sprung. Life, to be sure, is nothing much to lose, but young men think it is, and we were young. Tokyo in 1950, 5 years after VJ Day, after victory in World War II. The Japanese, who had fought like tigers, were taking defeat like lambs, and the occupation was going swimmingly. For the American troops, it was more like a sightseeing tour than a tour of duty. In a quaint and curious land, the soldiers themselves seemed a little quaint, a little curious. In the age of the ultimate weapon, the big bomb, who needed soldiers anymore? The rocket's red glare had long since become the flash of nightclub neon, and Army life, for the most, was summed up by a bit of Army slang: no sweat. The theme song of the occupation could well have been the popular Tin Pan Alley tune of the time. Its title was Enjoy Yourself. Enjoy yourself, the song said. Nobody was paying any attention to the line that went, "It's later than you think." It was getting late that summer in 1950. Westward across the Sea of Japan, in a different country, not very far away, a different tune was being played. Korea. North Korea. A satellite controlled by the Soviet Union as a result of the Second World War. North Korea, an armed camp. Russian equipment, heavy tanks from Vladivostok, and Russian-trained troops to man them. While the Western world looked elsewhere, everywhere but here, for the next outbreak of communist aggression, the North Korean People's Army was already on the march. 90,000 fanatical troops obedient to the commands of the Kremlin. An exhortation to the North Korean troops said, "Let us protect our glorious pride by completely annihilating the enemy." The enemy, as always, would be freedom. The target would be south. For the Korean people, World War II had meant liberation from 40 years of ruthless rule by Japan. Korea had seen many a conqueror come and go, but now something new had come to Korea. Here in the South, under the shield of the United States, a republic was established that held the hope of eventual unity and independence. But an ancient Korean proverb said, "The water downstream will not be clear if the water upstream is muddied." A slash across the map at the 38th parallel was what divided Korea, north and south. But the 38th parallel did more. It divided two worlds. On June 25th, 1950, the two worlds collided. The North Korean communists attacked the Republic of South Korea. The South Korean army, outnumbered and overwhelmed, broke under the surprise assault. With its open, armed aggression, communism overnight made Korea the powder keg of the world. The world could not ignore the agony of the Korean people, and from among the 20 million of them under the shield of the United States, a voice was raised and it said, "Should Korea die deserted, a wail will be heard through the corridors of history, whispering to the nations, adieu to allies, adieu forever to collective security." From 7,000 miles away, there came an answering voice. It was the voice of the American delegate to the United Nations, and it said,
"The Republic of Korea has appealed to the United Nations for protection. I am proud to report that the United States is prepared to furnish assistance to the Republic of Korea."
To the 7th U.S. Fleet in the Western Pacific came the word of President Truman in Washington. "I have ordered United States Air and Sea Forces to give the Korean government troops cover and support. By executive order, without declaration of war, America was in it. Japan and endanger Formosa and undermine the whole American position in Asia." But planes and ships were not enough to stop the communist advance. On June the 30th, 1950, America made the ultimate commitment. In the age of push-button warfare, in the time of the big bomb, the foot soldier who wasn't going to be needed again got his marching orders. Korea was his war, like all the other wars. It was never officially called a war. It was called a police action. A police action organized to halt a bandit raid. But a surprise, an ugly one, awaited the first American troops in Korea. The bandits were carrying bigger clubs than the police. They had the tanks, and we had carbines, and sometimes American troops, unseasoned and unprepared, broke and ran. The word for it in Korea was bugging out. The Soviet tanks kept coming, and the obsolete bazookas couldn't stop them. They kept coming, and the mortars couldn't stop them. Nothing stopped them. I can't stand it, a sergeant said. Seeing friends get it and not being able to help drives you crazy. I thought the Hurtgen Forest in Germany was bad in Normandy. But they were nothing like this. This was awful. They had come from the easy occupation life of Japan, physically soft and mentally unready. The brutal shock of Korea was changing them from civilians in uniform to soldiers. The price they paid was grievous. But history would say this of them: they were the first American troops to take the field against communist aggression. The enemy's superiority was 3-to-1 and 8-to-1 and sometimes 20-to-1. For the Americans, it was a nightmare of far too little and much too late. Hold when you can, fall back when you must. Not every American knew what he was fighting for in Korea, but many learned what they were fighting against. Where communism marched, its wake was marked by horror. Their road led south down the stricken peninsula toward the sea, and their way was haunted by the specter of Bataan, of Corregidor, and Dunkirk. And the communist order of the day was exulting. Comrades, it said, the enemy is demoralized. But the American Supreme Command was saying something else. It was telling the world, the skill and valor of our troops in successive holding actions have bought the precious time necessary to build a secure base. They had bought time, but time was running out. A soldier who was there said, I guess I'm lucky. I'm still alive. But what it did to me, oh my God, what it did to me. One last foothold remained in August of 1950. One last corner. The enemy had all the rest. But in that corner, within the perimeter, was the finest harbor in Korea, Busan. They came pouring into Busan together, the supplies and the men that said the communist war in Korea is a war against the United Nations. For the first time in 5,000 years of recorded human history, a world organization was taking up arms to oppose aggression and keep the peace. But Busan had a nickname, Desperation Corner. With the sea at their backs, the perimeter troops were forced to face the most massive attacks of the war. For if Busan fell, all Korea fell with it. Now the orders were, stand or die. The immediate problem was to hold on to Busan, and it was held by troops under 3-star General Walton Walker and 2-star General William Dean. Dean was destined to become one of the war's heroes, and Walker and his 8th Army would be famous for their bulldog defense of the perimeter. But the entire picture of the Korean War would be changed, altered with one brilliant stroke by another general, Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Allied Commander of the Pacific. Once in another time of disaster in the Philippines, he had said, I shall return. Now at the low ebb of Korea, he planned another great reversal, and this time he said, I shall crush them. I must have the Marines, MacArthur said. And they came marching. The 1st Marine Division, the old breed of Guadalcanal and Peleliu, Okinawa. And the new breed, too. Boys who had never stood in battle, but were ready to face it. The regulars went and the reservists went. And their women watched them go as women of the Marines have watched and wept through all the years, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Now their men were going to the farthest and strangest war of all. The amphibious assault, MacArthur said, is the most powerful tool we have. We must use it to strike hard and deep into enemy territory. So the Yellow Sea saw a spectacle which many thought would never be seen again. An American naval task force bearing down on a hostile shore. Land behind the enemy, cut him off, destroy him. That was the mission of the Marines. They would need all their skill as fighting men and all their legendary courage to do it. The objective was the port of Incheon, high on the west coast of Korea. A Navy specialist said of it, "We drew up a list of every conceivable natural and geographic handicap. Incheon had them all. The tides were the second highest in the world, often 36 feet. The channel impossibly narrow, mined and treacherous." But MacArthur said, "The Navy has never let me down in the past. It will not let me down this time." He had conceived the strategy of it, knowing where and when and how to strike, and daring to do it. But he had said, "I must have the Marines." Now it was up to them. They went in at high tide on September 15th, 1950. The 1st Marines and the 5th Marines. They scaled the high stone seawall that girdled the harbor, and they stormed into Incheon. And they took it. Incheon, yes, but the real prize was 18 miles farther inland. Seoul, the capital of South Korea. Take Seoul and you cut off and isolate the communist armies. Take Seoul and you surround and destroy them. So after Incheon, those were the orders to the Marines. Take Seoul. places the Marines have ever fought, few were more hotly contested than the streets of Seoul. To those who said Korea was a minor, marginal skirmish in the fight for freedom, an answer could be given. Tell that to the Marines. They ran out of stretchers for their wounded. They had to use house doors. When he first conceived his classic Incheon operation, General MacArthur had called it a 5,000 to 1 gamble, but he had won. Douglas MacArthur was a man used to winning. He had the victor's style, and with the style of a victor, he proceeded to restore the capital he'd liberated to its people. President Syngman Rhee, he accepted the thanks of the Republic of South Korea. But it was only an interlude. He would carry his banner far beyond the city of Seoul. In the Great Korean Turnabout, the surge was northward now. Up from Seoul in the west, out of the perimeter in the east. And now the orders to the 8th Army were, pursue and destroy the enemy. Across the parallel, North Korea, enemy terrain. The invader was being invaded. Destroy. Wherever the enemy resisted, he was hit. Wherever he was hit, he was broken. The same troops that had once reeled back under the North Korean onslaught now turned the North Korean retreat into a rout. The troops hadn't heard before came from the jubilant Koreans all along the way. Manzai, hooray for victory. Now surely peace would come, and communism would go, and all Korea would be united. They drove north to the farthest limits of Korea, into the forbidding valley of the Yalu, where it forms the border with Manchuria. The 8th Army came north, and the 10th Corps. With them came their South Korean allies, who had vowed to wash their swords in the Yalu, and were about to do it. The Marines made camp at Chosin Reservoir. Frozen Chosin, they called it. Winter came early, sweeping down from Siberia from the roof of the world. But the enemy had evaporated. The fighting was over, wasn't it? All along the front, the word was back in Japan by Christmas. There was Thanksgiving turkey all around and the best possible trimmings to go with it. The war was over, wasn't it? is not a war like other wars, and not to be won like other wars. Across the border in Manchuria, beyond the silent mountains, and across the sullen Yalu, another enemy was waiting. Secretly, silently, at crossing points all along the border, 300,000 communist Chinese troops came flooding into Korea, and they hit with the impact of a tidal wave. Red China had struck, and suddenly it was a new war, a bigger war, and an infinitely more ominous war. A Marine lieutenant remembered how it was. I felt like crying, he said. But continual sudden death all around protected the heart with a certain callousness. And a dispatch from the front was saying, the flower of the U.S. Army, almost the whole effective army that America had, was caught in a desperate retreat. If this defeat were allowed to stand, the dispatch said, it would mean the loss of Asia to communism. Thousands of years ago, in another age, when the Assyrians fell upon the children of Israel in another little land, the voice of the prophet was raised in lament. What will ye do in the day of visitation, and in the desolation which shall come from far? To whom will ye flee for help? In our time, in Korea, there was cause again for lamentation. They fled south to escape from communism. A silent sermon to the world by 1 million North Korean refugees. In a place called Hagaru at Frozen Chosin, the wounded were being flown out. The Marines had stood and fought against overpowering waves of fresh, battle-hard Chinese. Now for some, there was a reward of sorts. Some could say, I've got that $1 million wound. I've got my ticket out of here. 5,400 wounded were lifted out of Hagaru. Busan had been called Desperation Corner. Now in the north at Hagaru, in the second Great Korean Reversal, there was a new name. Panicky Pocket. But there wasn't any panic. Not at Udamni or Hagaru or Kodori. The Marines first held off the enemy and then assembled for what history would call the greatest fighting withdrawal of modern times. They were cut off front and rear, outflanked right and left, engulfed by 6 crack Chinese divisions. In Washington, they were being written off as lost. In Peking, the red radio was saying the annihilation of the 1st Marine Division is only a matter of time. But the men inside the Chinese trap were saying, we're coming out. We're coming out fighting. We're coming out like Marines. The sea and began an 80-mile march through some of the most savage terrain on Earth. And when reports called it the first Marine retreat in history, their answer was, retreat hell, we're just attacking in another direction. All along that endless, nameless road, the enemy was dug in. All through those murderous mountains, there was battle. killed the new enemy as they went, and they captured him, too. The Chinese peasant soldier, tough and formidable when he came in numbers, but no Superman when outfought and ravaged by the Korean cold. Where are we, the Chinese prisoners often asked. Many thought they were still in Manchuria and that the United States was invading China. A column of 14,000. 12,000 of them Marines and the rest Army troops, South Korean troops, and British Royal Marines. There were two enemies, the Chinese and the weather. 25 degrees below zero. Even Genghis Khan, somebody said, would not have tried Korea in the winter. Without the man in the sky, the man on foot could not have made it. Out of the flying boxcars came manna from heaven. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, the stuff of life that kept the column marching in a barren, hostile land. Not only manna from heaven, but fire and brimstone, too. Fire and death for the enemy on all the hills and ridges and valleys along the route. From the ground, the column summoned terrible pun on the encircling Chinese. Napalm, jellied gasoline. Once during the worst of it, a Marine was asked what he most wanted if God would grant him any wish. And his answer was, just give me tomorrow. He got his wish. They came down out of the murderous mountains down toward the sea. And one who saw them coming said of them, they paid a terrible price for the right to live. It had cost them more in casualties than Tarawa, but they had left a battered enemy behind them, and they had broken out when neither foe nor friend thought it possible. Now they had made it. Hungnam on the Sea of Japan, the goal. They came singing a bawdy soldier song, Bless 'em All, with unprintable lyrics of their own. And with them came thousands of others, troops of the 10th Corps, streaming down from the north. 105,000 men in the greatest sea evacuation in American history. Perimeter now, with gunners pinning the enemy to the surrounding hills until the guns themselves could be trundled aboard ship and leave Hungnam behind. refugees. At Hungnam alone, 100,000 of them. It was not a victory. It was an achievement. It saved a reversal from turning into a catastrophe. One thing remained to be done, and the engineers did it. High over Hungnam Harbor, the last pilot watched the last ships leaving. They formed up, he said, single file, nose and tail, like circus elephants. They headed seaward, then south to Busan. Christmas, the pilot, for it was Christmas Eve.